Right. Good morning, everybody. My name's Jason Fox. I'm the Senior Technical Evangelist at the FIWARE Foundation. And today we're going to be talking about local experts in B2B data sharing. For this particular video, I'm joined by Gregor Berger from DIH Slovenia and Rajiv Rani from the iSHARE Foundation, because what we are covering today is an extension to the existing FIWARE Experts exam, which is specifically covering data spaces. And this whole video can be considered as a companion to the previous How to Pass the FIWARE Experts exam, because it's not quite the same. There's different emphasis, there's a different background to what an LEBDS actually is, and what they need to do and what skills they need to have. So you can compare this with the previous video to compare and contrast and find out where the differences lie. The background to this situation is that there is a growing interest in data spaces, data sharing, and it's getting easier to do this sort of thing properly. And for effective B2B data sharing, you really need to make sure that when you've got multiple organizations trying to talk to each other, you need to use some sort of common framework, common standards. Now, you don't want to be building your own, because everyone else will have to start following your build the own to do it. So what we want to push forward here is the common concept of using or reusing existing tools, understanding why you should use those existing tools, and be able to create data spaces to add value to a business proposition. This is one of the things you can use FIWARE for. It's not the only one. So we need to have a look at the differences where we're going here. So what is an LEBDS? Well, they're a generalist. They need to have a lot of different understanding across a wide variety of roles. So, for example, you may be doing local business in Slovenia, like Gregor is doing. You may have contacts with various different local companies. You may need to have a deep understanding of one or two particular domains. Maybe you're in smart cities. Maybe you're in smart energy. Maybe you're not doing agriculture, but you are doing water. Whatever. There's going to be certain areas where you, as the local expert, will really know your stuff and really know how to work out where the data you will wish to get in your domain is coming from. When I'm dealing with the FIWARE tutorials or whatever, I have a sample farm, but it's not a real farm. It's not necessarily got real data or adding real value to the system. That's where you actually need to go to the actual end user and say, this is the data which we need to share to other parts of our system in order to gain real value to our system. What that is, ask an expert like Gregor. Now, for a FIWARE expert, you obviously need to know FIWARE, but for LEDBS, there are multiple ways in to this system. You could be, for example, someone who's deeply embedded in the iSHARE domain. You could be looking to expand that knowledge into linked data technologies and say, hey, maybe we want to standardize how our data space is working by getting into FIWARE. You could, alternatively, flipping it the other way up, you could be an existing FIWARE expert who has been using, say, NGSI V2, which is not usually used for data spaces, and you now want to expand onto the data spaces area, but then you come across the additional problems, which Rajiv will explain, that you really, really need some sort of form of distributed trust in order for a data space to work. The third and perhaps the most difficult way into this system, which is actually, I believe, Gregor's background, is that you're a domain expert from a DIH. You don't necessarily know FIWARE to begin with. You don't necessarily know iSHARE to begin with. But you're looking to come across a basic standard so that you can push forward and add value to businesses in your local area without going your own way. So you need to learn both FIWARE technologies and iSHARE technologies up to an appropriate level, and you need to be able to maintain the local, underlying standard. As I mentioned, LEDBS may not be as deeply embedded in the FIWARE ecosystem. They may be a FIWARE expert, they're probably not, but it's also the case that there are other bits of FIWARE, like the interoperability devices, which aren't really that important to data spaces. And therefore, if you're trying to certify a LEDBS, you don't really need to worry so much about certain parts of FIWARE. It's not that you want to be FIWARE expert plus, it's you're taking relevant parts of the FIWARE ecosystem, adding in relevant parts of iSHARE to come up with a system which is greater as a whole than the individual parts. So not everything is necessarily relevant for LEBDS. Looking at data spaces from a purely FIWARE only perspective, is that every participant in the system should be running a context broker. Each context broker can then either share or swap data or offer data to another context broker. You could have a registration, which would mean that you can then access technology from another part of the system. You could have, using the Apollo component, you could have a subscription, which then offers data to push directly into your context broker. You need to consider, where does the actual context data lie? Are there criterion where you wouldn't want to move your data out of your own context broker, but you would still want to offer the share of it? Are there situations where you would have background systems which are, say, hidden behind a context broker, like, I don't know, a device or possibly some sort of legacy database or something like that, which again has got a registration on that particular device, so that what you're offering, and what you're offering is all those black arrows on the diagram, is potentially a subset of all the data you've got, rather than necessarily all of the data you've got. Now, the other part of this diagram is, of course, the security side, which Rajiv will deal with in more detail. But in general, FIWARE is security system agnostic. We say you must have a PEP. Obviously, you must protect your context broker, but how you do it and why you do it will depend on the system in question. Now, this is where we move into the distributed trust area, and I pass you over to Rajiv.
Thanks, Jason. So as Jason already explained, the FIWARE only perspective of data space. But of course, there are still open questions in terms of security and how you trust each other, and how do you still keep the data space open so that other participants can still join your data space and benefit from the standardization of your tech stack. And they are also interoperable with you. So presenting then to you is the concept based on iSHARE framework, where we introduce a trust anchor, which you can see on the screen, which acts as an trust provider in the whole data space, where all participants are registered and they can find each other. And there is, of course, the name itself says that it provides the trust, as in there is a process through which the participants go through before they are onboarded into the registry. As well as when you are in the transaction, you can always make a check against the trust provider or trust anchor, whether that participant is known within the data space and it abides by the legal framework or the trust framework that the data space is based on. The difference that you see in the kind of the diagram now is that each context broker, they are separate organizations, except for one that I've combined, say, to give you another perspective, that one organization could also host two different context brokers. Irrespective of that, they are each organization is part of the data space, and they can exchange data with each other by using this standard way of sharing data using NGSI that's based on context broker, and the trust is provided in the data space with the help of trust anchor, and the common mechanism in terms of identification, authentication, and authorization, basically, so that you know exactly how to connect to another party, how to identify yourself to another party, and once you have already determined what data to be shared, you know how to read that data or process that data, right? So that is the concept of distributed trust. Of course, the PEP is also something where you are securing and authorizing. So you as data owner, what this framework on top of what I just mentioned, what it allows you is that by use of authorization registry, that is a role defined in the framework, which is basically your PEP. The data owners could specifically give authorizations on specific data points instead of role-based access. So, as Jason was mentioning, there is data from devices or other sources which you would like to expose, but you don't want to expose all of it. Then you can selectively choose and pick which attributes you want to share with whom. And on top of it, of course, because of the legal framework that is designed, you also attach data license behind it. And that essentially means that the consumer of the data knows exactly how to handle that data. And data license could actually restrict the data consumer to process the data in according to those conditions. Like, for example, the consumer could use that particular data only for one time for processing certain transaction, and after that it has to delete it, for example. That's one of the examples of data licenses. So that gives a lot of trust within the data space, and that enables the sharing of data with each other in a trusted and secure manner. Can we move on to the next slide? So here, thank you. So here what we explain is the 12 building blocks that you see on the screen. They are based on OpenDI building blocks for creating our data spaces. And there are essentially, they can be divided into 4 verticals. The first vertical talks about data interoperability, which has 3 blocks, basically: data models and formats, the data exchange API, and provenance and traceability. So data models and formats is all about the modeling of the language of the data, so that parties who want to exchange data with each other know exactly how to interpret the messages that are coming in. So it can be XML, JSON, any other kind of format of data, but then you need to know and understand how to interpret that. And also the language, also the meaning of the attributes inside of that. So you need to know how to interpret each attribute and the values that contain within. Data exchange API is how do you connect to each other, which formats you connect, and what when you send a request, in which format you will get the response in. That should be known, or that should be understandable. Provenance and traceability is of course the origins of the data and the traceability aspects of the data. So that's on the data interoperability. Then the middle block is about data sovereignty and trust, where you need to have basically the identity management, so that you can reuse perhaps your identities that you already have to get access to data at various organizations. That is what is enabled by this framework, and that is what we call distributed trust, so that you don't need to keep on create multiple identities of your own at every potential portals and organizations that you want to get access to the data with. Trusted exchange is actually when there is a need for exchange of data between organizations. Of course, you need to be sure that you are sharing the data with the right organizations, and you want to be assured of that it is indeed that organization with whom you are sharing the data. And that is basically where the trust anchor comes into play. And of course, last but not least, in the data sovereignty and trust is about access usage and access and usage control policies. So as I was explaining in the previous slide, with authorization and PEP, basically what you do is control who has access to what attributes of your data. And with the help of data licenses, you also control how the data is used when the consumer receives that data, right? Of course, you can expand that by implementing technical enforcements on the consuming side, so that you are further assured of how the data is used and it is in accordance um, with the conditions. But of course, that depends on the use cases and the justification of doing such an implementation. Then, of course, data value creation is another block where the whole purpose of exchanging the data and opening up new possibilities to share data which you don't share now is to monetize on the data that you have, which you have not thought of yet, in terms of how can you monetize on the data that you have, right? So, of course, the first part is metadata and discovery services, where which block deals about how do you make available the data and how do you explain to the others parties that what data is available, and how do you interpret that data, right? So and of course, then the next block is about publication marketplaces. So this is one of the ways in which you can monetize your data by publishing it in a data marketplace, where you as a data provider, you can find a lot of consumers. So marketplace acts as a party who connects the demand side and the supply side for the data. So and consumers can search via marketplaces for the data sets they are looking, and they can find all the different providers. And of course, when there is a actual transaction and you want to take monetary benefits out of it, and the data usage and accounting takes care of that part of keeping uh, the transaction log and billing and those aspects. So these are the technical verticals within the data space, but there is, of course, a non-technical aspect to every data space, and that's the data space's governance. And these are the key blocks which we think are a part of the data space governance is the business agreements. So business agreements deals about the regulations, the local sector specific rules, and various other aspects in terms of how each party organizes and um, within the data space, right? Whereas the operational agreements are more about the SLAs and the operational ability. And there are, of course, various certified service providers within a data space. So what level of service do you expect from them, as well as what level of assurances do you need from them in terms of organizational processes and other aspects. Then, of course, there is another block of organizational agreement, where that block is specifically for the data space itself, so that the organizations of each data space, they can set specific organizational agreements for which are only pertaining to that data space in that block. Now, as you can see, of course, on the screen, that we have also put the logos of FIWARE and iSHARE on top of each block. So FIWARE covers essentially, FIWARE provides open source components for all the technical building blocks, and they are ready for you to be used. And you see iShare logos on the middle aspect, that is the data sovereignty and trust, because we provide the framework, trust framework, and the specifications for identity and access and authorizations, basically, as well as we cover some basics on the data governance, because we provide you a structure which you can use as a template to set up your own data space governance structure. And some aspects of business agreements and operational agreements are already covered, on top of which you can, of course, add any additional data space specific agreements which you would like.
And of
And with
course,
that,
by looking at the various logos for the all 12 blocks are relevant to LEDBS. However, only the 9 blocks with the FIWARE logo are relevant to the FIWARE Experts exam. Similarly, the additional blocks which are covered by iShare only are required for the LEDBS, but not required for the FIWARE Experts exam. It was interesting hearing Rajiv right at the beginning of his explanation saying that your data format can be JSON, XML, what have you. Obviously, for FIWARE, it's important you would be using the NGSI LD specification, which is based on JSON LD. But of course, iSHARE can be used with other data formats in pretty much the same way as FIWARE could be used with other security mechanisms. It's a case of we are combining our strengths to make something greater overall. So, in order to try and push this concept forward, we need people who understand what this is all about. So there is an examination process, and we're trying to find local experts who understand all the concepts which Rajiv was pointing out, all the stuff which I was pointing out. And in order to do this, we base this on the initial FIWARE Expert examination. As I said, the basic FIWARE Expert procedure is the same, but there is a slightly different marking scheme. And obviously, there is this additional section on distributed trust, which Rajiv will take later on. You should compare the LEDBS examination with the other exam, which was a video was taken earlier, because you will find that there are subtle differences between the way things work. For the FIWARE side of things, you follow the procedure which you can find under that link there, which is saying that you'll have a board of 3 FIWARE experts or technical employees from the FIWARE Foundation or whatever. And it's a 30 to 60 minute structured interview, which we will cut down because we don't want to stress Gregor any more than we have to. And then on top of that, there is an additional iSHARE security test. So Rajiv, could you explain the iSHARE test?
Yeah, so iSHARE test is, the test procedure is almost the same as FIWARE test procedure. So it's more like an interview process where we simply ask a few questions on the conceptual understanding of iSHARE concepts and role models, basically. As well as then providing an architectural scenario and seeing the applicability of the concepts that are understood with iSHARE, and that is combined with iSHARE and FIWARE together as iForTrust. So the questions could be on the applicability of just the FIWARE iSHARE framework or iForTrust as a concept in the whole. Yeah, that's a short.
Now, the grading process is precisely the same as the grading process for the FIWARE Expert exam. You are graded on elements such as your body of work, your understanding of the FIWARE Catalogue, architecture. However, the body of work is not specifically your body of work with FIWARE technologies, because it is broadened to being your background in FIWARE technologies and or data spaces. As I mentioned earlier, there are multiple different backgrounds you could come in to actually try and understand this. What the grading here would still be done as if it was on FIWARE Experts, but the thing is you can also get extra points, extra credit if you have a data spaces background. Similarly, the understanding of the NGSI interface is more pointed towards the NGSI LD interfaces, which are relevant for data spaces compared to NGSI V2. And furthermore, overall for the pass on the it's a pass fail rather than pass fail distinction. So you need to get what is the equivalent of a grade C for all sections, although it is possible to get a grade D on the devices because it's not directly relevant to data spaces. Now, for the grading on the trust side, I'll ask Rajiv to fill you in.
Yeah, so here as well, we follow the similar structure. However, the the points that we grade on, or the kind of questions, either they relate to the concepts of the framework or the role model, and thereby the application of it. And because iFortrust building blocks which are provided, they are based on iSHARE framework, so you need to demonstrate the understanding of the concepts of iSHARE, as well as how do you apply the concepts of iSHARE in terms of data sharing, and how do you connect, how do you design your solution in terms of sharing of data. And when it is more in context of iFortrust, then it, of course, then we also ask you in terms of combined with FIWARE, which components allow you to achieve that. And the grading model is same, so you at least need C to pass in this each block in order to be promoted as passed as LEBDS.
So on to the exam. This is where we welcome Gregor. Good morning, Gregor.
Good morning.
An existing LEDBS who's already taken the exam, already passed the exam, but has kindly decided to let us take him through it again and grill him with a series of questions. Now, the following slides are very much the duplicate of the FIWARE Experts exam slides, because the idea is to be able to compare and contrast the two. So the first section of the exam is always body of work. And the first question I'll ask Gregor is, briefly describe your current background with FIWARE and or data spaces.
Thank you. My name is Gregor Burger, and I'm part of the iFortrust experiment named eWine to Wine. We want to take the data from the vineyards and transmit them down the value chain to the marketers and other entities to provide better user experience and to provide superior products. We think that this traceability of the data is really important, especially for the small wine growers. And we found in the FIWARE and iSHARE components that enable us to build our product. For the FIWARE side, we use two context brokers, Orion LD context brokers. One side is for the data providers. This is the data from the vineyard. And on the other side is the context broker for the data consumers. These are marketers, shops, and entities like that. We also use the NGSI LD API to transmit the data. And of course, on top of that, we use the iSHARE components for the security.
Now, what would the examiner be looking at this point? Well, normally we'd be saying, okay, how much FIWARE has he got? Right. The previous candidate I was looking, I asked this question to, had been on the board of directors of the FIWARE Foundation for 4 years. That would be an A, right? Strictly speaking, if you listen to Gregor's background as to how much FIWARE he's got, he's somewhere between a B and a C at the moment. However, if you add in, okay, well, what's his data space background? Is this a data space he's dealing with? It would bring up, if he was say a D, he isn't, but we can bring up a D up to a pass mark, because it's a broader range of questions here. This is one of the areas where even if you haven't got the complete iSHARE background, maybe you say I'm learning iSHARE to add this onto my system or what have you, you can still pass this particular section. It's just basically pass fail because of the additional information you need. However, the second section is on NGSI interfaces, and the first question, there's usually quite a few questions on this. I'll just pick two. The first question I'll ask is, where would you find the temporal data within an NGSI request/response?
Well, the temporal data is dealing with the historic data. We can look for the temporal endpoints and found it under the temporal/entities. We have to know that these request responses are optional and they use the normalized format. We have to look in them for the property of property observed at. This is kind of timestamp when the event or the event took place at that time. And in these responses, there are the attributes of type, value, observed at instance ID, and unit code.
Now, at that point, you notice that what Gregor answered there, he answered purely based on NGSI LD. If I can ask him a direct question, do you have any experience of NGSI v2 at all?
No.
No, you see, it's not necessary for this LEDBS. Now, that obviously would be a demerit if you were looking at purely the FIWARE expert stuff. But for the LEDBS, because we're talking about data sharing, linked data, the LD stuff is really rather important, whereas the V2 stuff is not going to be used. So therefore, it's not surprising that his answer covers the LD, but not the V2. Now, as I said, you usually ask lots of questions on how the data is pushed between the system. I'll just ask one more. What NGSI operations are available beyond standard CRUD?
Yeah, we have a lot of operations, let's say subscriptions, registrations, pagination, querying, temporal queries, context refresh operations, some aggregational functions.
Now, if we had more time, I'd press him onto more details as to which area there is. But you can see that he has an understanding about what the API can do. And, I might say, ask, okay, give me more details about the subscriptions, or can you explain precisely how registrations work or what have you? But the idea is that if you are going to clearly create a data space, you might want to use any of these particular endpoints to try and make your life easy. Let's move on. As I said, it gets code quite quickly. We then go on to some of the more areas of the FIWARE Catalogue. And I'll just ask the one question here, which is, what options do you have when persisting context data to a database?
We have to know that the context is only interested in the current state. So the context broker is not the database. So if you want to put the persisting data into database, we should use some components, and we have the components in the FIWARE catalog that we can use to provide persisting data to the database. If I mention two, one would be Cygnus, generic enabler, and the other one would be Draco. They have specific roles, but they do the job.
Are there any other components which would do, say, short-term history?
Short-term history, yeah, you have the Comet generic enablers that is more short-term history oriented.
Yeah, it's always an interesting question here as to whether you use the temporal interface or you want to push stuff into a short-term database. It depends on whether you want all the data, some of the data, etc., etc., etc. And as you noticed, the examiner may ask a follow-up question if they think that you've got more information in there, and it's all about gaining your extra points. You can see that obviously this candidate is familiar with the FIWARE catalog. He's got some idea when to use which component. He's opinionated. He'll say, I prefer Draco because X, Y, Z. Now, there are multiple areas in the catalog. Probably the least important for data sharing is IoT agent. So I'll skip over there. But you could be asked questions on any particular section. Now, security kind of overlaps to the area which Rajiv will be dealing with in a bit. But basic security questions are fundamental no matter what, whether you're using data sharing or not using data sharing. So some of these questions like describe the difference between authorization and authentication is a good question to ask anybody. So authentication, authorization, which components are involved and why, and what is it?
Basically, authentication allows users to identify themselves and they obtain a token so that they can gain additional access or they get access to the system. We can use the component like OAuth2 component to get the to proceed the authentication. Authorization is on top of the authentication, and it also defines the roles and permissions that user has in the application or the system. There are two components that we can tie to this. These are the policy decision point, PDP, and policy execution point, PAP component.
It's interesting the way that Gregor answered that when he was talking about generic security components rather than a specific security stack. There are obviously certain FIWARE Catalogue components which are specific to connection with iSHARE, for example. And there are others like you can. I mean, as I said, we're agnostic. We've got a security stack which works with KeyRock. We've got one which works with KeyCloak, one with Keystone. But it depends on whether they will actually give you the appropriate PDP, PEP endpoints so that you can use it elsewhere. Now, obviously, normally we'd spend a lot more time on the going through the system here. Please review the other video if you wish to see yet more questions being answered. The next section is an architectural scenario. Now, in this case, I've deliberately picked the same scenario as was given in the previous video. If you read through this particular scenario, which is a long form of text, you will realize this is not a data space. This particular question, which was created about 4 or 5 years ago when the FIWARE experts examination was set up, is an NGSI v2 scenario. It is one where you have a single context broker, which is then talking to devices and potentially third-party endpoints directly. So what we would need for the LEBDS scenario is the same concept, but with multiple players, multiple organizations in the system. And obviously, we need to get both the FIWARE components and the iSHARE components on this. Again, I'll hand you over to Rajiv to grill Gregor further.
Yes, thank you, Jason. So yeah, of course, before we move on to the architectural scenario, I also want to give a bit of gist in terms of the general conceptual questions that I asked before we go into the architecture scenario. And the questions are like more, what in your opinion is, what is iSHARE?
Basically, iSHARE is foundation that provides the security and trust in the data space and in the sharing of information, where the FIWARE is dealing with the physical moving of the data, sending the data and exchanging the data between the components. The iSHARE provides the trust and the security for these operations of exchanging the data.
Yeah. So yeah, of course, as you can imagine that I go further on with asking more questions like, okay, can you elaborate on certain aspects in terms of how does it provide trust and other areas like is there only technical aspects or there are non-technical aspects which are covered by the framework? This is just to give you a bit of idea. And of course, then other questions that I ask is, say, for example, can you explain more about when two organizations are sharing data? Do iSHARE see the data that is being transferred between two organizations?
No, sorry, can you repeat the question?
So does iSHARE see the data that two or more?
Okay. Sorry. No. The iSHARE does not see the data. It's only facilitates the secure sharing of data, but it doesn't look at the data.
Yeah. So the similar conceptual questions about iSHARE framework are being asked, and of course, then we ask about more on the authorizations and authentication aspects, like and the role model, of course. So maybe briefly, Gregor, if you can describe the roles that we have defined in iSHARE framework.
Yeah, we have basically we have the satellite. Each data space must have at least one satellite.
Mm-hmm.
So there we have the registry authority, where we have the this is the component that holds the users, and the roles and the level of services that they get in the system. Then we have this PEP and PDP point, so that they evaluate if when user is trying to access the service, if he has the right credentials, if he has the right role, if he can access this data or this service. We have the identity providers that hold the identities of the our users, and we have the this marketplace that we offer the services and products.
Yeah. Okay. And further about the parties which are exchanging data.
The parties that are basically you are talking about the PEP and PDP point, or
So yeah, so the role model, of course, also is based on the data consumers and data providers, which are part of the framework as well. And the PDP and PEP is basically used by them in order to make sure that they can exchange data. Okay, then let's move on to this architectural scenario that we see on the screen. So just giving extending the similar example that FIWARE uses. However, now this architectural scenario is more in the context of data spaces and how data spaces are created. So just an example of this scenario is about tourist board coordinating on exchange of data between organizations, and making sure that with the sharing of data, it can guide tourists in certain manner. So based on this scenario, can you map out the roles that are defined, which organization will play which role based on this scenario?
Basically, the tourist board will be the data provider of all the data, and we will have these entities that will bars and this bicycle rental shop that will be data consumers.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have this application that will basically serve us as a way of monetizing and using the marketplace services.
Okay, so it's interesting to know that the answer is that the organizations which play these roles that Gregor answered, and they are valid in one context of the use case where there is some data that needs to be provided by the tourist board to these organizations, so that certain services can be extended to them, like for offers or other aspects. But when the scenario changes or the use case where there are different aspects, the roles can be switched from being provider to becoming a consumer, and vice versa, right? So it's perfectly all right. The same organization can play multiple roles in any data space, but it is always asked in the context of the use case. So you always need to explain the use case and the role mapping that is derived based on that.
Yeah. One of the points which I couldn't fit onto the slide, but is actually put onto the actual exam paper, is that you are allowed to ask the examiner for additional clarifications and information. So if you read the scenario and you think it's a push from the tourist board down to the bike shop, you can say, is it that way around or is it the other way around? And that you can ask for more clarification, because let's face it, if some company comes into your office and says, I'd like to set up a database like this, you're not just going to take their scenario, you're going to take their scenario and question them for more information to make sure that what you are providing is a valid data space for the overall system. Back to you, Rajiv.
Yeah. So yeah, that was more or less the kind of questions I would say we would ask, and I think that was it, right?
Okay, so aftermath. Well, if you're lucky, and you're a clever guy like Gregor, you will get a nice response, and your organisation will be listed as an LEDBS on the i4Trust website. There are not that many people who've actually qualified, so it just shows that there is a definite understanding here. Of course, it could be the case that you don't succeed, and if you don't succeed, you will still be given a response, but you'll be given a response in both cases, which will give you feedback as to where your mistakes or failures actually were. Now, it's never fun to fail. I know myself, I failed quite recently. I was on a cycling holiday, which is probably where the scenario came from in the first place. And I found that the mountainsides in Gran Canaria were a little bit hillier than I wanted. So after the first day, I thought, sod this, I'm not going to be able to make it up the mountainside. I was given some advice. And taking the advice, change it to lower gear, change it to a different bicycle, doing a bit of a practice run, I was able to attempt the same mountainside later on and succeed. And the point is that a failure it's like failing your driving test. Just because you failed your driving test once doesn't mean you're never going to learn to drive. It means that you haven't quite reached the level yet. Now, obviously, once you have reached the standard, it means that if someone comes to me and says, "Do you know anybody who understands data spaces and wine?" I can say, "Well, I know a guy in Slovenia who knows data spaces and wine, and what's more, he's got a certificate to prove it." So there's going to be a common understanding of how this works. Now, like any examination, you need to study. It is not that simple, even though Gregor makes it sound as if it's quite simple. There are multiple documents, both from the FIWARE Foundation and the iSHARE Foundation, on the basic structure of the examination, on how to understand the FIWARE payloads, how to understand the roles in iSHARE. But the real proof of the system we're putting forward is actually within the very dry technical specifications of the systems themselves. If you've got the understanding of the NGSI LD technical specification, the latest one came out in September. If you've got the understanding of the iSHARE technical specification, then you will understand how you can build these things in depth, and you will be able to pass the examination yourself. Any further points on that, Rajiv?
No, I think you summed it up nicely.
Gregor, how did you find studying for the examination?
It was a challenge because you figure it out quite quickly that it's more content that you perceived at the beginning. So you see that you lack in some fields, like mine is probably IoT devices, because even in our experiment, we are not dealing with the real devices. We are pulling the data from the existing platform. So and yeah, it's a lot of technical details that you have to memorize, and it is great if you have the hands-on, if you can try it with your hands, if you are working constantly with the iSHARE and FIWARE components and interfaces. So.
So, without a final study tip, I'd like to thank you for attending today. I'd like to thank both Rajiv and Gregor for taking part, and good luck with taking your LEDBS examination.